So Doctor Who has introduced yet another big canon-shattering idea in the form of bi-generation. So whereas in the past the Doctor has regenerated in a linear fashion from one incarnation to the next, and each incarnation has followed the previous one, what we got this time with David Tennant regenerating into Ncuti Gatwa was a very different thing indeed, very different visually as well, where essentially, instead of the Doctor, like I say, just changing the Doctor's face, morphing into the next one, David into Ncuti, we had this visual of like conjoined twins, where both Doctors were there, the Doctor kind of split themselves open, there was the David Tennant Doctor, the Ncuti Doctor, they were kind of speaking to each other, and then eventually they were able to completely split off, and those two Doctors now coexist. It's not like one replaces the other one, they're both still out there. Lots to unpack, a very different take on regeneration to what we've seen in the show before. Very, very different, and yes, this is something that, you know, some people are fans of, some people not so much. In this video I just wanted to do a kind of big deep dive on bi-generation, this new idea, and what its implications are, both for the episode and for Ncuti's Doctor, and for the giggle, but also just more broadly as well for the Doctor Who canon, and the ways that this can actually make it easier to bring back other past Doctors, assuming it also applies to them. So I think the first thing to mention, in case people aren't aware, is that this whole plotline did leak some months back. It was the kind of infamous giggle leak, the infamous regeneration leak, or split regeneration. I've just found the leak again. It wasn't actually that easy to find, but it is still out there if you look in the right places. And I mean, yeah, looking at this, wow, there was so much detail here, and so much of it that ended up happening on screen. A real shame, actually, I think, that all this was leaked. You know, it kind of goes without saying, really. But yeah, it would have been really, really nice to experience this fresh, you know, for the first time upon actually watching the story. I know that many people will have had that experience and would have been able to just watch the episode, you know, blind. But yes, this information was out there, so it did make it a little bit more difficult, you know, and it's just a shame that it was out there. I think on the one hand, a bit like with previous leaks, you know, concerning the Timeless Child thing, for instance, it sort of makes it a slightly easier pill to swallow, I think, because it gives us, you know, these months in advance to kind of mull over the idea and get used to the idea. It's obviously not the way that it's intended to be, but that's just how it ends up going. So, yeah, I think kind of a lot of people before this had heard the idea and were sort of maybe kind of coming round to the idea. There was some initial backlash, I think, because of the way that it was sort of phrased in that leak, this idea, obviously, of the Doctor splitting into two, and these two Doctors being out there, and there was some debate, I think, about which Doctor was, like, the real Doctor, so to speak, and which of the two TARDISes was the real TARDIS, and there was some debate about whether Ncuti's Doctor and Ncuti's TARDIS would be the kind of the splinter ones, and David Tennant would be the main Doctor. But I'm fairly sure from the way it was treated actually in the episode itself, that's not the case, but let's get into that now. So I think what I will say right from the off is that, you know, this is a 60th anniversary special, 60th anniversary specials. You know, it makes perfect sense for the show to do something like this that allows them to address the past and sort of outline a vision for the future as well. We had a similar thing with the 50th on a much smaller scale, I suppose, really, but with, you know, Gallifrey being saved and the Time War ending, rewritten, and the Doctor kind of going off into a future where Gallifrey still exists and is still out there. So, yeah, you know, it's not unheard of for things like this to happen. Obviously, 3 years ago, we had the Timeless Child thing, the Timeless Children, which again was a controversial kind of change to the canon, which sort of expands Doctor Who's canon, but not necessarily in a way that people enjoy or appreciate. And it's a similar sort of thing here. I think, you know, with Russell here making his mark and putting his stamp on the show for the second era and kind of for the Whoniverse and all this sort of stuff, and the Doctorverse, as he called it as well, in behind the scenes things, you know, I think there's a very clear sort of idea at play here, which is that Russell is trying to make it easier to bring back past Doctors. Now, Doctor Who has always brought back past Doctors. It's not something that the show has shied away from, and there have always sort of been ways around it, because the main sort of problem with bringing back past Doctor actors in the past has been that inevitably they look that bit older, you know, and I think people in the past have said that, you know, one day I'll be too old to come back on screen, or perhaps I already am, you know. People like Colin Baker look very different, or Tom Baker even as well, or even Peter Davison. I mean, quite a lot of the classic Doctors, really. Sylvester's still fairly similar, but with greyer hair and stuff, and Paul McGann as well, to some extent. But yeah, there's always been that massive obstacle in the way of bringing back past Doctors in a way that makes sense, without all the baggage of having to explain why they look older. And we've had stuff in the past, like in Time Crash with the Fifth Doctor, little explanations here about the timelines being out of sync or whatever, and that's why the Fifth Doctor looks slightly older than he was at the time, or something with the First Doctor and his face being different in Twice Upon a Time. Little bits and pieces like that over the years. Of course, in the Power of the Doctor as well, we had another answer to this, where the past Doctor actors kind of returned not as the Doctors per se, or as their Doctors, but as elements of the Doctor's consciousness. But yes, they've always had to find ways around it, find ways to explain it and reason it and make it make sense. And I think with this, with the bi-generation concept, from what Russell has said in interviews and behind the scenes things, basically his theory here is that this moment where the Doctor bi-generates into the 14th and the 15th at the same time, that kind of echoes back through the timelines, back through the other Doctors, and allows them to also coexist as the 14th Doctor is doing. So it's the idea that, for instance, on Androzani for the 5th Doctor, in one timeline the 5th Doctor continues and dies and turns into the 6th Doctor. In another sort of splinter timeline, the 5th Doctor survives and is still out there now, and grows older, like with this 14th Doctor growing old alongside the Noble family, not dissimilar to the Meta-Crisis Doctor as well, growing old alongside Rose, although obviously he's more of a splinter Doctor than the other ones. But that's the idea that we've got here, essentially. The 4th Doctor, for instance, he falls with that telescope in Logopolis, and in one timeline he turns into the 5th Doctor. In another timeline, again, he grows older, he survives, is still out there. Maybe he eventually becomes the Curator, and that's how that makes sense, and that's where the Curator fits into the Doctor's timeline. But yes, that is the idea, essentially, here, which, admittedly, isn't actually sort of explicitly stated on screen. The details, even of what's happened with the 14th to 15th Doctor transition, aren't made all that clear, which has led fans to speculate and come to their own conclusions. I think, for instance, some people have been saying that the 15th Doctor can only exist because the 14th Doctor does eventually turn into him, and so the 14th Doctor will eventually have to regenerate at some point in the future. But that's not what I take from it. What I take from it is that the 14th Doctor regenerated, in the Giggle, shot by the galvanic beam, laser, or whatever it was, and that's it. That's his regeneration. That is it for him, and he gets to just continue living until, presumably, he dies a normal sort of human death, grows older, or maybe he just continues forever, and maybe all the Doctors continue forever, and maybe that is the nicest way of thinking about this, I think, because it's sort of how we think about the show and the Doctor and the people that have played the Doctor anyway. Fans talk about the actors that have played the Doctor as if they still are the Doctor, because they are. Like, all those actors, are still the Doctor, like Jodie Whittaker. When she left last year, she didn't stop being the Doctor. She's still the Doctor now. She always will be. And it's the same for every single one of those actors that has played the part at any point over the years. And so this is a way of sort of formalising that within the show itself, within the universe, creating this Doctor-verse, as Russell dubs it, in a similar vein to something like that, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where you have got all of these, superheroes. It's kind of treating the Doctor like that, treating the Doctor and different incarnations of the Doctor like superheroes that you can just pull out the toy box, rather than having to worry about, I can't have this Doctor because we'd have to explain, where it comes in his timeline, and we'd have to explain why the Doctor looks older and how it all fits together. With this new vision of the show and of the character and of Regeneration, it makes it so much easier to bring back past Doctors and past Doctor actors in a way that makes sense. And I think that's what Russell would sort of say if you asked him up front about his reasons for doing this. I think this is kind of his gift, if you will, to the show and to the fans for this anniversary year, moving it forward. Now, of course, it's an idea that isn't perfect or isn't going to go down well with everybody, and even as someone who doesn't mind the idea myself, it's still a kind of a tough pill to swallow in some regards, because, does this mean, from now onwards that we're not going to get traditional regenerations where a Doctor morphs into the next one? Is every regeneration from now onwards going to be a bi-generation or a different type of regeneration in some way? I've seen people say as well that it kind of takes the sting out of Regeneration stories to some extent, because these stories aren't necessarily anymore these very big, epic, sort of end-of-era stories where the Doctor is fighting for their life and, you know, coming to the end of their lifespan and having to deal with all that angst and stuff, because they just keep on going anyway, so it doesn't matter necessarily when they die or when they regenerate. It's just the stakes aren't as high. And I can sort of appreciate that to some extent. But I think as well, Russell has said that, you know, with the Giggle in particular, it was a chance to do a Regeneration story that wasn't as angst-ridden as previous ones have been. And we have had some really depressing Regeneration stories over the years, and particularly in recent years as well. That has been the tone and the sort of approach with them, to make them these big, somber sort of occasions where a Doctor is dying and it's kind of treated as if it was death, you know, like death. Whereas with the Giggle, you know, we sort of thought we were getting that. And then it kind of had this magnificent moment halfway through where the tables are turned and you get this much more celebratory sort of twist to the story, where it's not about saying goodbye to the 10th Doctor or the 14th Doctor or David Tennant again, but no, he gets to keep on going, he gets to have this happy ending, and that kind of becomes the justification for bringing back David Tennant in the first place as a new Doctor. And I think it's the legacy of the 14th Doctor and of this era, you know, this Doctor, this storyline, and then bringing back an old Doctor's face has made it easier for other Doctors to return in a similar fashion in the future. And hopefully, you know, the 14th Doctor was the first of many Doctors that get this treatment and that come back for anniversary stories or anything else besides. Those are my thoughts on the bi-generation concept, on this big change potentially to Doctor Who canon. I think in short it's something that I'm definitely open to. It's an idea that will, you know, take a while to get used to, even with those leaks and stuff, and even having had that time for it to kind of seep in and to properly kind of process the implications of it. It's still a bit of a weird one, and a weird one to get your head round, but I think the intentions behind it are great, and I think, you know, in the future it is something that we will look back on and think, you know, that was Russell's gift to the show in its 60th year, to make it easier for other past Doctors to come back in a way that makes sense. But what are your thoughts on bi-generation and the way this transition from the 14th Doctor to the 15th was handled? I would love to hear all of your thoughts, positive or negative, or somewhere in between, down in the comments below. If you have enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new for more stuff like this in the future. But otherwise, until the next one, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.